Design and composition. Space. Hello, this is Charles Bernard. Once you've learned the fundamentals, you'll be able to give sharper and clearer expression to your ideas, saying what you want to say directly and interestingly in pictures. When you begin planning your pictures, try to form a clear mental image of the effect you wish to create. And don't settle for the first composition that comes to mind. You have to think and try many different arrangements in small, quick thumbnail sketches that I'll be showing you in this course. You are embarking on a journey with this course that can lead you from being a novice or beginner to an accomplished artist. But it is up to you whether you reach that goal or not. It all depends on how hard you are willing to work at it. This is a rough color sketch that I did. Now, what I want to point out to you is that it's okay to leave large, empty spaces, such as this negative space that you see here. It's empty space. And as you can see, it's rather large in size. It's made interesting by creating color variations. They're subtle, but enough to create interest. By leaving empty spaces like this, they help to add interest to the smaller shapes that are concentrated here, for example. They provide balance, relief from the more busy, dense areas where more shapes occur, such as here, for example. And in this diagram, you can more clearly see what I'm talking about. The more dense areas where more shapes are located that are smaller in size and that attract your eye are right here. This is where the eye is attracted because this is where the more dense area is, because more small shapes are located here than in other parts of this picture area here. And these larger contrasting shapes that are empty, they act as a foil for these smaller, denser areas where these shapes are located. They offset these smaller, denser areas. Because of this balance of dense and empty areas, interest is increased. If I started adding a lot of other shapes to this empty shape here, then this rough color sketch would start to look too busy. It would lack a balance between dense and empty areas, and because of that, it wouldn't be as interesting as it is now. The empty shapes can also be somewhat smaller. This here, for example, is an empty space, but it's much smaller, but yet it helps to balance the more dense area over here where there are more shapes located. If I added a lot of other little buttons here, you see that it would be way too busy and it would detract attention from the figure. This figure is composed of smaller shapes. Each of these here are shapes, and you see they make up a dense area of shapes, just as in this example here with these shapes. The same idea that you see here has been applied to this rough sketch. Then there are the shapes back here, little shape right there. Over here on his chair there are shapes. And then where I don't want a lot of shapes, I merge them or link them, like down here, for example, where these darks are. I create very close value relationships so that they merge together and make one shape instead of a lot of individual shapes that would add a busy area here. So the smaller shapes have been grouped together within this area to form a more dense area of smaller shapes compared to the other larger, more empty shapes. These dense areas of shapes should be located at the center of interest, like they are in my rough color sketch, because they will draw the eye of the viewer there. And that's what you need to do, to draw them to where the center of interest is. And by creating these dense areas, these concentrated areas of shapes, you'll be able to do that. This balance of dense and empty areas of shapes is very important, and it will add a lot of interest to your paintings, make them much more effective. The sketch on the right here is another version that I did, in which the color contrasts are not as strong as they are in this sketch. Here, the blue color contrasts strongly with the surrounding red and brown color, while here, this color is more of a red-violet and therefore relates more closely to the red and brown. You have to decide which kind of color contrast is more appropriate to the mood that you wish to create. And as I already mentioned, here there is a stronger color contrast than there is here, because here the colors are more closely related than they are here. In this example, there is a stronger alliance between this color and the dominant color of red, because the red-violet contains red. There are two dimensions that form an alliance with the dominant color of red, whereas in this example, there is only one dimension, which is intensity. So this example has a greater harmony and unity of color than this example. However, this example is still valid because of the alliance of the intensity of the blue with the intensity of the dominant color. The mood is somewhat different, however, because of the stronger color contrast than in this example here. Looking at this sketch here, I see that I could increase the color contrast by adding more yellow to the figure here, thereby creating a stronger contrast of yellow with the blue, making the sketch more interesting and helping to draw the attention of the viewer to this part of the composition to a greater degree because of the stronger color contrast here. Either one of these sketches would be fine to develop into a finished painting. Space is created when a figure, such as this rectangle shape, for example, is placed within it. Space is undefined until it is articulated by the placement of an object such as this rectangle. Until then, it remains undefined, which means vague, unclear, or formless. Space can be used to express the emotional state of a character. For example, if the character is claustrophobic, I use very little space. I have the character fill up a large part of the negative space. And this also expresses the idea that this is an aggressive character, forceful, something like that. Another example how space can be used to express the emotional state of a character. For example, if the character is shy, reserved, and lonely, for example, I use a lot of negative space, and I make the character smaller. Something like that, just to give you the idea of how space can be used to express an emotional state in a character. So you see in these examples how space can be used in an expressive way not just that it's there to be filled up with positive shapes and forms without contributing something to the composition. There was a great illustrator by the name of Harold von Schmidt. Maybe you've heard of him. He painted a lot of Western scenes. He was a master at composition, and one of the paintings that he did was of this lone rider in the desert. He's on his horse, and he's all alone. And there are these huge cumulus clouds above him, and in the distance there are some mountains, and then in the foreground some bushes and rocks, but he's all alone, surrounded by all this space, and this space helps to contribute to the emotional state of this character who feels all alone in this vast landscape of space. The loneliness of this writer is expressed through all of this space surrounding him. So this is another example of how space can be used for expressive purposes, to express the emotional state of a character. Here's a little rough sketch that I did to point something out to you. When you have a lot of empty space like this, you can activate that space by placing something within it, like this, for example. When the space has become activated, it has become energized, animated. It is no longer inert space, which is space that is dormant and lifeless. This empty space is not structured. And if you've been following the Art Track video series, and you had a chance to see Volume 6, Part 1 and Part 2, you will know what I'm talking about when I talk about structuring space. Therefore, if you haven't seen Volume 6, you need to see that. But I will talk about how this space has been structured. And the way I did that was by the addition of this plant here. You see, this plant serves a double purpose. Not only does it add more visual weight to the lower part of this sketch, but also it helps to connect the lower part of the sketch with the upper part and the middle part. How? Well, the answer is because of line continuation. And if you watched Volume 6, then you'll know what I'm talking about. The line formed by this plant, which is upward, is continued by these little rocks and into this part of this gun here and up, thereby forming one large continuous line that divides this pictorial space into two shapes. Each is of a different size, and they are both triangular in character. And by doing that, by having this line continue upwards, I have structured this lower part of the space because there are now two shapes. But not only that, also there's a line formed here, which further divides the pictorial space, and then there's a line formed here by the base of this rock that this figure is sitting on, and then another shape here. So there are a series of shapes which form a structure, and that's what is meant by structuring the space. A structure is composed of several shapes, such as you see here. If I didn't have that line down here, then this space wouldn't be structured like it is now. It would be empty, like in this sketch here. Here are two quick rough sketches I did. This one has a lot of open negative space. That is, it's not divided into a series of shapes like I showed you before that would close the open negative space. Open negative space means that there is no division of space that closes the space. Like this horizon line now establishes closed negative space. And if I remove it, now there is no division line, and therefore all of this space is open negative space. The negative space is the space that surrounds the positive forms, such as this form here, this figure. Also, there is negative space between the shapes or forms, such as this negative space here. In open space like this, there is something very attractive in keeping that space uncluttered. But it's difficult to balance that kind of open negative space with positive forms. When you leave a lot of open negative space like this, there is a danger that the painting will appear empty. This kind of open negative space is unstructured negative space because it hasn't been broken up by dividing that space like this into a series of rhythmic two-dimensional shapes, which would turn this negative space into closed negative space, as I have already shown you in other examples. However, this kind of open negative space can be balanced, however difficult it might be. There are superb examples by Oriental artists that used to do these black and white drawings, where they did leave a lot of space around the positive forms that they introduced into that space, and they managed to balance that space beautifully. So it can be done, and if successfully done, can really be something beautiful. It is, however, much easier and more success is ensured when the negative space is broken up, not left like in this example, without anything else in the composition except this positive form here. The negative space needs to be broken up into two-dimensional geometric shapes and integrated with the balance of the picture. And usually it's with geometric shapes of the subject matter itself. In this way, open negative space is turned into closed shapes and structured as part of the dominant or contrasting geometric shape motifs that you use within your composition. In this rough sketch, there's a feeling of a lot of empty space, and that's something that should be avoided. So that space needs to be filled up somehow. You shouldn't get the feeling of empty space. I could extend the figure into the negative space more, like that, and thereby eliminate the feeling of emptiness. Or I could divide the negative space into a series of shapes and thereby close the negative space, and this would eliminate the look of empty space. For example, what I could do is break up this negative space by adding some buildings here, for example, and then a horizon line, and then at the horizon line there are more buildings, something like this. See, I'm breaking up that negative space into a series of shapes. And now, as I mentioned before, if you were listening carefully, the negative shapes need to be integrated with the positive shapes when you're structuring the negative space by dividing it up like I'm doing here. And the way that's done is through line continuation. For example, the back of this figure has some kind of strap here or something, and then the edge of his arm is down here, and this strap continues into the edge of the arm. And now I need to integrate this positive form with the negative space that I just structured by dividing it up. And I can do that with this line here of the building that he is looking at. Something like that, and then windows over here, you see? And it's this edge, this diagonal, that continues into the strap on his back and then into the edge of his arm, thereby connecting this part of the composition with this part, locking them together. And also, I now created a large triangle shape because of that. What was empty negative space is no longer empty negative space. Now it's been structured, and that space has now been integrated with the positive forms. I changed it a little bit, as you can see, added a few more buildings, refined it just a little bit. So now I have structured negative space. And in the other example, this sort of structured negative space doesn't exist, because here there is open space as opposed to closed space. Using this little rough sketch that I did, I'm going to talk about what is called active space. And active space is dynamic space. Right now, this little figure is floating in a sea of negative space that surrounds it. This negative space has no shape to it. If I tried to create a shape, there is nothing for me to create a shape with. It's just space surrounding the figure. One could say that, well, the shape of the space is the shape of the format or the picture area. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the space within the picture area having a shape, not the shape of the picture area itself. Active space has a shape to it. And since this space doesn't have a shape, I need to turn it into a shape. And the way I can do that in this little sketch, for example, is by extending the ground on which the figure stands to the edge of the picture area, right to the border, like that. Now, the negative space has a shape to it. Since I added more of the ground, all of this is positive shape. It is figure as opposed to ground. A positive shape is referred to as figure, and the negative space is referred to as ground. So now, the shape of the negative space is this. Coming up to the positive shape, which is the edge of this ground here, going around the ground, then around the figure, around the staff he's holding, and down to the edge of the ground like that. Now, the negative space has a shape. As you can see, it's this shape here. By making that one change over here, by extending the ground to the border, I was able to create a shape where there was none before. And also, by extending the ground to the border, now this positive shape or figure has been anchored within this negative space, and it's not floating. Try always to anchor your shapes by extending them to the edge of a picture border, or, as I did here, have another shape that they are connected with extend to a picture border. I'm going to show you another example, and right now I have an empty picture area. Space, however, is created when an object is placed within it. Space remains undefined until it is articulated by the placement of an object within it. And I'm going to place this shape within this negative space. The negative space that I have now created is, however, an inactive space. It is not an active space because it doesn't have a shape. The eye travels around this shape. Space surrounds it. The shape is also floating within this space. But as soon as I extend the shape to the right picture border like this, now the shape has been anchored within this negative space and a shape has been given to the negative space. And I'll show you what that shape looks like. Following the picture area like this, and then around the positive shape and around like that. You see, that is the shape of the negative space. In this way, you can make your negative space interesting by giving it a shape. The negative shapes must be just as interesting as the positive shapes. They are no less important than the positive shapes. There's something else I'd like to point out to you. This shape has been centered within the picture area, and so has this. However, by centering it within this pictorial space, I have neutralized space, because the variety of spaces surrounding this shape isn't as great as it could be if I moved that shape to a different position, such as this, for example, where now the spaces are all different, you see? And by doing that, the negative space has become more dynamic and active. And I can do the same with this example here. By moving it further down and to the right, I now have a variety of different negative spaces surrounding this positive form. And thereby, I made the negative space much more interesting, more dynamic and active. Try to avoid placing your center of interest or main subject within the center of the picture area, for the reasons that I have just shown you. Unless you have a very good reason to place that subject in the center, don't do it. You're not going to get the interesting variety of spaces surrounding your main subject. When your shapes have been placed in a position such as this, off-center with a variety of different spaces surrounding it, then the negative space has become more dynamic. You can make that space even more dynamic, like I showed you before, and give that space a shape by bleeding the shape off, or cropping it off, or extending it to one of the picture borders, like this. Now the space has become even more active, and thereby even more dynamic. I did this really rough, quick sketch in order to point something out to you about negative space. Be aware of where the negative space is leading. This is the negative space here, and it's creating a negative path that leads right out of the picture. The eye moves along negative space. So if you create this kind of path, the eye is going to follow it right out of the picture area. There should be spaces in a composition that are not busy. For example, this space that you see here is quite empty, and it balances the busy area of the buildings at the top of the picture. But unfortunately, when you do this, the bottom doesn't relate to the top. You need to relate the two different areas, one to the other, so that this space down here is not isolated from the top part of the composition. And the way you can do that in a case like this, for example, is by adding a value that repeats the value within the top part of this composition. So some of this value down here is seen up here. And by repeating that value, I have now related the bottom part of the composition to the top part. And of course, it can also be done with color. If I have, for example, a building here that has this color, and I add some of that color down here, now the bottom part of the composition is related to the top part through color as well. Or if I repeat one of the shapes that is up here, down here, something like that maybe, a curved shape. Now this bottom part is related to the top part through shape. So by repeating something that occurs in the top part of the composition, at the bottom, you relate the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom. Also, you can have rather flat spaces that will act as foils for spaces that are more busy and that have more form to them, that is, more dimension. A portrait, for example, just very quickly indicating here something. So the background could be a flat space, something like that, which then acts as a foil for the face that has form. I gave it some form by putting this little shadow in here. It has some dimension to it as opposed to the flat space in the background. And then I could add maybe a decorative texture here, something like that, you see. So this area could be a little more busy, and the background is quiet, calm, and flat, and acts as a nice balance to the more busy areas and those that have more dimension to them. I did this really rough sketch to show you that negative space has a directional movement to it, just as positive forms do. The movement or action of this man is toward the right border. The border has a pull on the man and pulls him toward the right. To strengthen or reinforce this movement, the mountains in the background have a directional movement toward the right as well, thereby repeating the movement of the man toward the right, and this helps to further strengthen the feeling that he is moving toward the right. Always look for ways through which you can strengthen the action of the figure. Use the background, like I have done here with these mountains, to strengthen the movement or action of the figure. Now, if I, for example, added some birds here, these birds attract attention. They attract attention here to the right side of the picture. And because of that, the eye of the viewer is drawn toward the right in the same direction that the figure is moving, thereby further helping to strengthen the movement of the figure toward the right. But not only is it strengthened by these positive forms of the rocks and mountains in back of them, but also by the negative space, which is right here. Negative space is empty space. It is devoid of positive forms. And this negative space has a movement toward the right, just as the positive forms have a movement toward the right. And even the negative space of the sky here has this horizontal direction, moving toward the right. So everything is moving to the right, strengthening the action of the figure toward the right. I've also increased the feeling of action in the figure, of movement to the right, by placing the figure out of balance. That is, leaning him forward, placing him at an angle like that. And if I draw a vertical balance line like that through the figure, you can see that there's more weight on the right side than on the left side. Therefore, he is out of balance. And the fact that there is more weight on the right side and that he is leaning forward like that helps to increase the feeling of movement to the right. This space is horizontal, and therefore it has a horizontal directional movement. This serves as an example to show you that negative space can be used to strengthen or reinforce the direction in which a figure is moving. Now, negative space makes negative shapes. Negative space has a shape to it, so you have to be aware of what kind of shape that negative space makes, and that shape must be as interesting as the positive shapes. And if you've been following my videos, you'll know what makes an interesting shape. And one of the things that makes the shape interesting is irregularity, as I have shown you in previous videos. If you haven't seen those videos, I highly suggest that you check them out. When you establish the action of a character, such as this, the background needs to reinforce that action. So many paintings that I see where the artist just doesn't understand this or has no knowledge of it, and they just put any old thing in the background that they like. That's not art. The action itself needs to be strengthened. That's one of the purposes of the background. It's not, the background isn't there just to fill it up with whatever appeals to you. It is there to strengthen the action of the figure. And you need to know how to do this. And so many artists don't know this. And their paintings are just not very effective. They may render a beautiful action figure, but the surroundings, the background, does not support the action, does not strengthen it, does not reinforce it. And that is a big mistake. Now also, there are diagonals in this figure. The angles you can see at the edges here, the contours, you see, there are angles all over in this figure. And these same kind of angles or oblique movements or diagonals are set up in the background by these mountains. Here I could maybe darken part of this mountain so that more of a diagonal can be seen. See, so these diagonals in the figure are echoed or repeated with variation. That's what echoing means. Repeat with variation. Repeat an element of design such as line. This is line and direction. The line is created by the contour. That's the kind of line I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a line like that. A line can be the edge or the contour of a shape. And that kind of line, which has a diagonal direction, is repeated in the mountains in the background. And this further helps to support, strengthen, and reinforce the action of the figure. As you can see, I made a few changes to these mountains. I strengthened some of the diagonals, and also I made some diagonals have a similar direction as the figure. You see, this diagonal repeats the same direction that the figure has, and so does this one here. Even though this one is farther away from the figure, it doesn't matter. There's still a connection formed through this parallel direction. They have the same or very similar directions, and therefore a connection is established between them. Always try to repeat the rhythms set up within the action of the figure, within the background, so that the background will then support the action of the figure and strengthen it. And in this case, the rhythms in the figure, as I've already pointed out, are the diagonals. Now, as I have shown you, there is a reason why things are done within a composition. I didn't just put this horizontal negative space here because I felt that, oh, it looks nice. No, it was put here for a specific reason, to strengthen the movement of the figure. Everything that is put into a composition must be there because it fulfills a specific purpose. Everything in a composition must contribute something to it, must contribute something to the whole, or it should not be there. Here's another quick sketch that I did to show you another example of how I use negative space to reinforce the action of the figure. The figure has a vertical upward direction, and so does this negative space here. It too has a vertical upward direction, repeating the upward vertical direction of the figure, thereby reinforcing and strengthening the action of the figure. The space, the negative space, is supporting the action of the figure. Everything in this little sketch is pointing upwards, supporting the upward direction of the figure, strengthening the action of the figure. These mountains in the distance are pointing upward. They have a triangular shape to them that points upward. Even this building in the background has an upward direction to it. You see? Repeating that upward direction of the figure. And, of course, as I already mentioned, the space, the negative space itself. So you see, what is in the background hasn't been put there just to fill up space. It's been put there because that background strengthens the action of the figure. And also, the negative space, as I've already mentioned, has a shape to it. And that negative shape needs to be interesting. And in this little sketch, this is the negative shape, which is irregular. And because of that, it's an interesting shape. An irregular shape is more interesting than a non-irregular shape, such as a geometric shape. So you need to make your negative space an interesting negative shape by making it an irregular shape, such as you see here. Another thing I'd like to point out to you about negative space is that the eye moves along that negative space. It moves, for example, up like this and then around the shapes. It moves around the shapes because it can do so. If there was an obstruction here, then the eye would be stopped by that obstruction. But since there is no obstruction, the eye is free to move along that space, around the shape, and down like that, or around this way. It has that freedom of movement. So the eye will follow paths of negative space that you set up within your composition. You can direct the eye where you want it to go by these negative space paths. So space has a direction. Quick example here. If I have the subject matter at the top of the picture area, then all of this empty space here pushes up. The movement is upward. Another example, if the subject matter has an oblique direction to it, such as this, you see a diagonal movement, then this space has an oblique direction to it as well. When you create a symmetrical composition or symmetrical balance, where you have an object on the left side and then the same object on the right side, for example, what happens to the space surrounding the subject matter is that that space is being pushed to the peripherals of the picture area. This is the space, but it's being pushed to the borders of the picture area, which means the space becomes neutralized, which means that it's no longer dynamic, which means that you need to establish an asymmetrical composition, which will then give you a dynamic space as opposed to the static space established by a symmetrical balance or composition. Space is emptiness. And when I'm talking about space, I'm talking about negative space. The great artist Edgar Degas, he was an impressionist artist and probably one of the greatest artists of composition that have ever lived. He was a genius at it. And what he did in his compositions was he would create a busy area or an area of density, which means a lot of shapes that make for a dense area, and he painted a lot of ballerinas. So what he would do is, in an example like this, these would be figures, and maybe then over here there would be a wall, something like that. But all of this, he would leave empty. This would be the floor, for example, where these ballerinas are practicing. So he has this dense area composed of a lot of shapes, a lot of figures, a lot of ballerinas grouped together, for example. And then, like I said, maybe there's a wall back here that they're seen against. But down here, he would leave everything empty. So he creates a balance between fullness, which means a dense area because there are a lot of shapes, and then an empty area where there aren't any shapes. Sometimes he would separate one figure or isolate it from the group of figures, like this one here, which would then help to focus attention on this figure, and the figure in this space becomes the center of interest, because when you place an isolated figure into the composition, the eye is attracted to that figure that's not part of the larger group. Other times he would keep the group, but then enlarge one of the figures within that group. And by doing that, that enlarged figure becomes the center of interest. It's the figure that the eye of the viewer is attracted to most because of its size, and also because of where he places it. He places it in the foreground. The other figures are in back, and the larger figure is in the foreground. So the eye is attracted to this figure. It becomes the center of interest. He always keeps an empty space, though, a large negative space to balance the fullness or activity or busyness or dense area. They all mean the same thing, basically. A busy area balanced by a quiet or empty area. And these large empty spaces that he creates, he makes interesting by creating an interesting irregular shape. Irregular shapes make interesting shapes. Students always think that you have to fill up every space, otherwise the painting isn't going to be interesting. Well, the fact is, if you fill up every space and you don't have this balance of dense and empty areas, as I've been showing you, that's what makes your painting less interesting. It's not putting in more that's going to make it more interesting. It's actually putting in less that's going to make it more interesting. Make sure, however, that either the positive shapes or the negative shape dominates. That is, one needs to be made larger in area than the other. Also, this negative space needs to be made interesting. And you can do that, for example, by grading a value from dark to light, like that, and also creating color variations within this space. That will help to make it more interesting. And if you have a dark mass like this, A mass can be three-dimensional or two-dimensional. It can be a tonal mass, or it can be a mass created by a form that has solidity, solidness, dimension to it like that. That's also a mass, a three-dimensional mass. And then there's a two-dimensional mass created by a tone, a flat tone like that. The tonal masses, such as this dark tonal mass, needs to be balanced in your compositions. So by placing a dark down here and then grading it to a lighter value, I could balance this dark tonal mass up here. A gradation like this will add interest to your empty negative space, and because a gradation, if you remember, has a lot of weight compared to a more flat tonal area, this helps to balance the dark mass up here. Another way a tonal mass like this can be balanced is if I make it smaller so that the negative space dominates in size. The space becomes more important now. This dark mass can be balanced by a larger, lighter value, but this larger, lighter value is enough to balance the darker mass here. It's like this on a weighing scale where you have a larger, lighter value and then a dark value over here, which is smaller in size, and that small dark balances this larger, lighter value, and that's what you see here. So that's how a dark mass like this can also be balanced if you have a large negative space. Usually in a painting, it's the positive shapes that are larger in area, that take up more area than the negative space does. This helps to ensure that the positive shapes are the ones that are more important, and that the negative space is less important. But that doesn't mean that it's less interesting. It needs to be just as interesting as the positive shapes. Empty areas are very important because they provide the visual rest within your composition. The rest the eye needs from more busy or more dense or complex areas such as this. That kind of balance between busy and quiet or simple areas needs to be established. Otherwise, there is just too much activity, too much busyness, and no rest for the eye. I would say the most overlooked single visual element of design is space, just empty space. Because so many students and artists also feel that every inch of the painting must have activity, must have something there. Otherwise, it's not going to be interesting. The great master Degas shows us that that is simply not true. You can have empty areas and still have an interesting and exciting looking painting.